Welcome back to Through the Lectionary. It's good to be back with you. I took a short break over the last week or so, but it's great to be back as we look at the epistle text for the 10th Sunday after Trinity, and that is written in Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols, however you were led. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another, the ability to distinguish between spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of the tongues. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so just a refresher about this church in Corinth. Paul tells us very early on, in the first chapter, that they're not lacking in any spiritual gift. And when we talk about spiritual gift, this has kind of been warped a little bit as far as what the church kind of did with these things in the 20th century, right? A long, long time ago, back in those 1900s. 60s, 70s, 80s, especially the church in the 90s, when all the emphasis was placed on these spiritual gifts inventories, as if you could somehow, find your new members of the church and give them this list, and they could fill it out, and you could say, "Oh, your spiritual gift is so and so," and typically these things always, spoiler alert, always came down to where the church needed the most help at the time. It's like, oh, your spiritual gift is this. Oh, it just so happens we have a spot on that committee. But when we talk about spiritual gifts or anything like this, it's very, very important to really take apart that phrase and see what it is actually saying. And we're saying gifts of the Spirit. So not these like floaty down things that, almost like, there are things of the earth and things of the floaty realm, and these are just these things that you feel really passionate about and all of this, and it must be of God. These are gifts of the Spirit, so it's important also to read forward in the scriptures and to see what the Spirit's ultimate work is, what the Spirit does, what the Spirit gives, okay, and what the goal is. So it's not to just completely isolate these verses, but to read them as a whole. So hopefully we can begin to work through that. But back to the Corinthian church, there was nothing they were lacking. A small church at the time, of course, small maybe compared to what we think Corinth looked like, way less than 100 people at the time. But of all the gifts that they had, none lacking, they couldn't get along. They were fighting. They were not using their gifts according to the way God had intended them to use their gifts. They were fighting, right? One household, I follow Paul, I follow Cephas, I follow Paul, I follow Christ. And what's the end of that? And Paul says, is Christ not one, right? And he's getting to the same thing here. Look, they have no gifts lacking, but what's the purpose? And it's the same Spirit who has given them all of these gifts. So unity is the goal. So concerning gifts of the Spirit, these gifts given by the Spirit, he does not want them to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols. Now, Paul has talked about this also back in chapter 6, about the life they once lived, how they were. But they are not that way anymore. And Paul says they're not that way anymore because they were sanctified. They were justified. They were washed. All of this happened how? By the Spirit. This is the Spirit's work. Sanctification. It's a big word, simply meaning to be made holy, or, in other words, to be set apart. And this is what we see happening all along in the Scriptures. God setting His people apart all the way from the beginning. Right? God creates all of creation, and it is all very good, but He creates this set-apart garden, and He takes man, and He sets him apart in the garden, right? And God's people all along the way fight against this set-apartness. They don't want to be set apart. They want to be like everybody else. In fact, those are the exact words that are used with Samuel and Saul when God's people want a king, and Samuel says, "No, God is your king." And they say, "No. We want to be like all the other nations." They don't want to be set apart anymore. So it's this constant fighting against God's will that we see in the Scriptures. But the Spirit continues to work, right? The Corinthian church fought against this set apartness. They wanted to be apart from each other. They didn't want to be set apart as the church. They wanted to be like the world. They wanted to go back to their old way of living because they didn't see a problem with it. So they fought against it. But Paul here is encouraging them to come back to live as they are supposed to live. He doesn't want them to be led astray, right? Verse 3, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit. So again, they were taken out of this pagan life, okay, where they were saying Jesus is accursed, and now they're saying Jesus is Lord because they are in the Spirit. They are distinct, they are separate, right? But their lives are not demonstrating that at this point. Paul wants them to turn. Now, there are varieties of gifts, okay? It's important to also note where Paul goes next after this text as he's talking about the church being one body with many members, right? If all were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If all were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? These kinds of things. The different gifts that are given to the church are given for a reason, that the church may be whole and may do the work that God has given her to do to the glory of God. Okay, so there are a variety of gifts, not so that we can play the game of who's greater, who's least, but so that we may serve and love our neighbor. This is the end goal. Varieties of service, but the same Lord. There are a variety of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them all to everyone. So one God who gives all of these different gifts to all of these different people. Yep, one God, one church. And we use the gifts that God has given us to do to His glory. Now, sometimes we may not like the gift that God has given us to do, but that doesn't mean we don't do it or look for something else to do. We do it because the church has need of that gift, right? God has not given it in vain. He's given it so that we would ultimately go on and work for the good of the church in order that all might be saved, right? This is the end goal, and God's name then be praised. So when we see these spiritual gifts played out as the church wants to play them out today. And at the end of, last century, it was, oh, I wish I were like this person. They have the gift of fill in the blank, and it's such an extravagant thing, and and that's really ultimately, and this may sound a little bit harsh, but that's really no better than Pharisaism. Do you remember how the scribes used to walk around in long flowing robes and all of this, um, and people would see that, and it's like, oh, such righteous people. Remember the widow who put in the 2 small copper coins in the temple treasury. All she's doing is trying to be a good Pharisee, but they've been putting in so much more. Well, she can never, if that's the way righteousness is measured, she'll never, ever measure up. So in the same way, we're not ranking ourselves according to what God has given to us as a gift. We are simply putting it to use for the glory of God, for the good of the church. Variety of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them in all in everyone. Verse 7. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Again, been saying this. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. Listen to how many times he says, by the same Spirit. Right? Again, I said they're dividing themselves. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. It's not that Paul gives these gifts and Apollos gives these gifts and Cephas gives these gifts and Jesus gives these gifts. It's the same Spirit who's giving them all. And do we not think that God knows what he's doing? Of course he does. So he goes through all of these different gifts that were alive at the time, right? As we connect these chapters 12, chapters 13, and chapters 14, we see that some of these things have passed away with the apostles. Very important. So we you kind of need to continue 1 Corinthians. But the point is not necessarily the types of gifts that are given here. It's that the same Spirit gives these gifts. And the purpose for which he gives these gifts is that we may love and serve one another to the praise and the glory of God. So again, where the church kind of got twisted up on this is they wanted to identify the very, very specific gifts and say, well, here's your textual description about what kind of gifts there are. So you must have one of these and all of this. And it's not the case. We miss the point. We ultimately become like the Corinthians at that point, fighting over who has what and who's better than the other at this point. But that's not the point. The point is unity in the Spirit. As right, one Spirit, one church. That's where the text goes, beginning with verse 12. So it's always important to read forward, to read everything in context. Okay, so going down all the way to the end then, verse 11, all these empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. So again, I don't know how many more ways to say one Spirit, one church, all according to love and to the glory of God. So that's the text for Trinity 10, the 10th Sunday after Trinity, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. So as we go on with these texts, with these epistle texts toward the end of the church year, we're going to see kind of a turn, right? As we near the end of the year, more preparation for the end. So we have a couple of days too worked in here, festival days, saints days. Next week will be the feast of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We'll talk about those texts. We have also coming up the remembrance of the martyrdom of John the Baptist coming up on August 29th. And then, of course, worked in toward the end of the church year, we'll look at Reformation and All Saints Day, and then we'll be close to the end of the church year with all of what that brings. With the beginning of the church year, then, with Advent, we will be cycling into the gospel texts, and we'll do 1 year of gospel texts. So, comment down below what you think about this First Corinthians text, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for taking a trip through the lectionary with me. Like the video, comment down below with questions, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.